reading these intellectual ideas from the neoliberals, I thought the left should have more concrete ideas of their own. As in, I disagree with these conservative ideas, but I think the opposing framework should match the rigor of these conservative ones. When Marxists talk about, we want to liberate humans and all this, and create this good society where people can do what they want, but then they sound like reactionaries when they say, but we will dominate the world and we will have, so many slaughterhouses and factory farms because you can eat so much meat. And socialism has this problem where you have this party elite, which can become tyrannical, or it has this bureaucratic elite, which can become self-serving and also undemocratic. And how do we overcome these problems? By having direct democracies.
Good afternoon, Troy. How are you?
Good. Yourself?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Well, it's such a pleasure to talk to you partly because I've got a real soft spot in these conversations for grand utopian visions. And you certainly have one of those in your book, Half-Earth Socialism, which we'll come back to later on. I've heard you describe it even as a potential end to history, as a sort of vision, but a good end to history as opposed to the one we sometimes feel like we're barreling towards. So it's great to get the chance to talk to you and explore your own philosophical journey and how that's led up to some of the ideas you lay out in the book. And you know this already, but I guess this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the deepest philosophical questions and the ones that tragically humanity seems to get wrong, and even many philosophers get wrong. The questions of, what's real and how should we understand reality, the questions of epistemology, and just as importantly, the questions of ethics, what matters and who gets to matter in our moral systems. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to popularize and develop this really simple pluralistic worldview called Sentientism, which in response to the what's real question says, well, we might never know what reality is and what's true, but we should at least use evidence and reason, a broadly naturalistic approach to trying to work that out, hopefully with a healthy dose of humility thrown in. And when it comes to the ethical question, it's pluralistic on which ethical system you apply, but it says whatever approach you take, surely every sentient being should matter, should warrant at least some basic level of compassion or moral consideration as we work out how to go about creating a better world. So I guess that's my sort of upfront bias, but I'm lucky to talk in these conversations to a dazzling variety of people, some of whom agree and many of whom don't. So it'll be interesting to explore your own thinking how that plays in or not. But before we get on to those, how would you best introduce yourself and your work?
So I'm an environmental historian. I'm based right now at the European University Institute in Florence. I'll soon be going off to Berkeley, but I'm here for a few more weeks. And I work on neoliberal environmental thought. So that means the intellectual history of neoliberalism. How do neoliberals in their own journals and their own discussions understand what natural problems are, environmental problems that they face, and how they might solve them within the constraints of the market. Obviously, I'm very critical of these ideas, but I think it's important to take these ideas seriously in a way that most people don't. And it's also surprising to find out that a lot of neoliberal environmental ideas have been taken on by other groups, including the environmental movement and the left even. So that's what I work on generally as a scholar, and more as a polemicist. I worked on a book called Half-Earth Socialism with a friend of mine, Drew Pendergrass, who's a physicist at Harvard. And we wanted to understand what is causing the environmental crisis, and also what does it look like to have an ecologically stable society. So instead of just muddling through and trying to just survive crisis after crisis on a dying planet, it's like, what does it look like for humanity to have a good relationship with other beings on this planet, and to also ensure the good life for everyone as well. So that was the thought experiment we were trying to figure out with the book. And we do many things related to these books. And for example, we made a computer game where you can play as a planetary planner. We're also thinking of making a board game. There's some spin-off projects we're working on, including articles, potentially a sequel. And I'm doing stuff as well for the Neoliberal Environmental Project, including a couple edited volumes and monographs. So that's generally what I work on.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. And I've had a go at the computer game, and it is quite mind-blowing because I have this sort of naively optimistic view about answers to things sometimes, and you go into that environment with that naive view, and very quickly the reality, a bit, albeit the simulated game reality, breaks down those assumptions and that naivety as you realize the myriad trade-offs you've got to make. It's a hard problem even within that simplified environment. So there's a lesson there in its own right. But yeah, it's fun to play with and instructive too. So
Yeah, hopefully teachers are using it to talk about the environmental crisis with their students. And, I think the game is hard because the environmental crisis is a pretty daunting task for us to solve. So it takes you a few tries to beat the game for sure.
Yeah, I haven't got that yet. So so we'll come back to that later on, but let's start with, I guess, your sort of philosophical journey and what's led up to the way you think about these problems today. And the first of these big philosophical questions is that one about what's real and how to best go about understanding the world. And there are so many different aspects to that. There are modern challenges of misinformation and disinformation and conspiracism. There are different modes of thinking that can be well or poorly founded in evidence. There's all sorts of different aspects, but often one interesting starting point for my guests is to tell a story about how they grew up originally and whether that was in maybe a more supernatural or mystical or religious family, society and context, or one that was maybe more naturalistically minded, more scientifically minded, maybe atheistic or agnostic, and how that side of their thinking has changed over time, if it has. So you can wind the clock back as far as you like to sort of tell the story of how you think about the big pictures of understanding this crazy universe.
Sure. I think whenever people talk about their PhD, dissertations, it's always an autobiographical project. So I came to write about neoliberal environmental thought, and that is really important for how I understand ecosocialism. They're really in conversation with each other. And that's because I grew up in a fairly conservative household. We weren't religious, but I would go to I was a young Tory and go to Conservative Party, events and all this. And I would read Milton Friedman and stuff like that. So, and that lasted until my early 20s. And then I had a real crisis of faith in terms of this conservative worldview. And that was related to the failure of the Iraq War and also the crisis of 2008. And so that's when I realized this worldview wasn't working very well. And I drifted for a while, ideologically speaking. And then I started reading Marxist works, especially New Left Review. And I also became much more interested in the environmental crisis. And that was partially of this self-awareness that I had been a fairly sensitive child and interested in animals and the environment. And then when I was a teenager, I was affected by toxic masculinity. I was trying to be macho and all this, and eat lots of meat and be more callous. And then when I had this kind of breakdown of my worldview, I also wanted to return to that childhood passion for nature and also question this machismo. So these things all kind of came together. And then through my graduate work, I started studying, trying to understand that worldview, but also find alternatives in this environmental, in this eco-socialist space that I started to gravitate towards. So that's basically my intellectual trajectory.
That's quite a journey.
Yeah, well, I think some people, they grow up, as they say, with red diapers. If you grow up in a left-wing family and you are reading Trotsky when you're a teenager and all this, that's one way to do it. But I think there's always a risk that you might turn, to the other side. And for me, because I came from the right to the left, I feel like I'm inoculated. Like I know that side very well. And I know one should also take them seriously, but I also know the flaws of their worldview.
Is that also partly why you continue to study neoliberalism now, rather than just because my sense is that many on the left sort of disregard neoliberalism, put it to one side, and work on their own project, whereas you're still investigating, interrogating, and questioning and deepening your understanding of that worldview, even though you disagree with it, or because you disagree with it.
It happened haphazardly. Like during my PhD, I was initially studying the East German coal industry, then I shifted to the Canadian oil industry, and then I kept finding that there were all these frameworks to basically greenwash this very destructive industry, and many of them were these neoliberal ideas. such as cap and trade or bonds for strip mines and things like this. And I want to understand, where did these ideas come from? Then I found out that no one had really done an intellectual history of these things. And I think there is this condescension from the left where they think that they are the real intellectuals and the right doesn't have any real intellectual worth. And therefore, the neoliberals, they're just applying either like neoclassical economic ideas to this idea of homo economicus. They're just applying that as cookie cutter fashion to other problems. Or capitalists just want to make more money. They want to pay a few, less wages, and that's all there is to neoliberalism. Just privatize and crush unions. And the neoliberal project, because I have this familiarity with it, albeit at a restricted level, I think I had this I was in like the first circle of hell of neoliberalism in a way, where I'm reading Milton Friedman, and there's many other layers to neoliberalism, and it is a pretty unusual and creative and eclectic intellectual formation. But again, I think you're right. I think I took it more seriously because I knew it better than most socialists. And I suppose by reading these intellectual ideas from the neoliberals, I thought the left should have more concrete ideas of their own. As in, I disagree with these conservative ideas, but I think the opposing framework should match the rigor of these conservative ones. And I find that wasn't often the case. A lot of left-wing or environmentalist ideas are just like, oh, we'll just make commons and, we'll figure it out after the revolution. And that's not very good. I mean, that's not enough compared to the neoliberals, where they have not just one or two, but they have like 10 ideas for many different kinds of problems, many spheres of life. So that was important. I also would say my mother, she, although a big conservative, she was always interested in the environment, and she also was part of the Green Party and ran for the Green Party in a few elections. So I had, I think, that to fall back on as well when I did kind of return to this childhood interest in the environment. So that's basically my intellectual formation. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And it sounds like on the epistemology front, you grew up in a non-religious family. My assumption is that, do you maintain a sort of naturalistic way of thinking today, and that you use maybe a broadly scientific way of trying to understand the world using evidence and reason, that there aren't elements of the transcendent or the spiritual or the supernatural in the way you think about things? Or have any of those aspects ever sort of come into the way you?
I don't think those things necessarily contradict each other. So, I mean, I'm not religious and never have I been religious, but I'm also a historian. So I know that people have thought about, life, and they've organized society in many different ways. So I am generally skeptical of thinking there's like one true path of living, or one true way of relating to each other or to animals and plants and so forth. So I'm more of a relativist, or maybe a Kuhnian in a way, where I think the way one should evaluate different worldviews would be to see them as paradigms that are internally coherent, but have different assumptions and are hard to compare with each other. And really, you have to compare how internally coherent are they compared to the internal coherence of another worldview. For example, the neoliberals, they think that the market is this information processor that is superior to any other form of knowledge production, including science or democracy and so forth. And therefore, everything should be set on a market basis. But I just don't find that very compelling. You can see many examples of market failures. But if you believe that, then everything else they're doing makes sense, I would say, right? So I think you just have to evaluate that. But in terms of this more like sublime, or this more, I wouldn't say spiritual, but I think like a different way of relating to life rather than being purely rational is also important. So especially when it comes to the environment, I think there needs to be something, there needs to be space for these moments of experiencing the sublime. And that's one reason why I'm a big bird watcher, for instance. And, I remember bird watchers, they talk about their spark bird, and that's the bird that really gets them into bird watching. And I remember the first time I saw this very large cormorant colony. There's something like 60 or 80,000 birds on this one beach. and the beach looked black, and I didn't realize what it was until I realized they were birds, right? I thought it was like a black sand or something like
Wow.
that.
Yeah.
It's full of birds, and that was actually in Toronto. So that's a major North American city, and they have this huge colony of cormorants there. And then after that, you get kind of hooked. But that kind of feeling where you're seeing something very alien, but also very vast and powerful, or very beautiful. These are important experiences. And this is where, in my future work, I want to work on this idea of what Deleuze and Guattari talk about becoming animal versus Haraway's notion of becoming with. This idea of becoming animal is this intense fascination for the animal, and this idea of almost like kind of leaving your own body in these moments of contact, and we should make space for that relationship, I suppose. So it's not really a rational relationship. I think it's very important.
Yeah. And I think you can find plenty of space for that in a naturalistic worldview, broadly defined, because some people will find those sorts of sensations and feelings, experiences, that sense of awe or wonder or connectedness, and that is grounded in some sort of genuinely supernatural belief. They think there is something beyond the natural world that gives them those sensations and feelings. Whereas for me, I think I can feel a lot of those things in a completely naturalistic understanding of the world. And to my mind, a properly naturalistic understanding of the world doesn't crush things like emotion and intuition and a sense of connection and, awe and wonder. It has to recognize those because those are aspects of our experiences, and our experiences are real things, right? So, I'm lucky enough to do quite a lot of volunteer work in schools, and that's one of the topics that comes through quite often is that you can feel a really rich sense of awe, wonder, and transcendence through a naturalistic understanding too. So,
yeah, but I mean, I think it makes sense. Or can you imagine if we were going to an alien planet and there was lots of life forms, and we're like, wow, it's amazing. But this planet's pretty crazy, and we just it's full of life everywhere, and it's extremely complex. And these life forms are descended from creatures from like millions of years ago. And I mean, it's nuts. And I think we just get used to it and get jaded. But when you have these like moments where you really see how wonderful existence is, I mean, that I don't think that's something that should be crushed by over rationality, but it's just the truth that we live on this amazing planet, and it's important to recognize that.
And the journey you took of your political worldview shifting, to what degree do you think that was influenced by, facts and knowledge and learning about the reality of the world, and how much of it was shifts in our next question, which is values and what matters and ethics, or was it a sort of a mix of the two as you went through that journey?
I think, this is where I don't often try to convince people with just like a battering ram set of arguments, because I think people only change their minds when the cracks are starting to appear and then they're looking for something else. And I think the only thing you can really do and talk about my own experience is that people can, sow the seeds of doubt that maybe eventually will become something else. Because for me, when I was younger, well, first of all this right-wing economics I was reading, it's like, yeah, we'll just privatize things and we'll lower taxes. And then I was like, but I'm not sure if that is actually working. You actually look at the economy that you're in, you're like, this kind of sucks. So I think there was some doubt there already before that break. And also I did know some vegetarians when I was a teenager and in my early 20s, and I would argue with them quite a lot, and I would try to kind of rationalize my own meat eating. And I always felt dissatisfied with my own efforts. It was hard to make a convincing and coherent case for omnivory. And I think when I had that break, and I was like, then I could return to that. I'd be like, yeah, that wasn't satisfying. I should try being vegetarian. So I think like I had that doubt for a while, but it's only when you have those moments of real break, real rupture, then you can actually change how you live. So, but these previous encounters were important.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we should come on to that, those questions of ethics, and hit them directly now. And I guess the first way of asking that question is what matters in the fundamental sense. So you and I think, share a broadly naturalistic way of understanding. So we don't have, God or a religious book or a list of rules that tell us what right and wrong are. So in the absence of that, it's quite interesting to explore what is the grounding of ethics if it has one. And again, it would be interesting to know how that's developed through your life as well. I don't know how you started thinking about those things as a kid and how that story is developed up till now. What are good and bad and right and wrong even mean? I mean, how do you assess those things? Is there a way of doing such thing?
I'm not an ethicist, right? I think as a Marxist, Marxists tend to be pretty bad at ethics. So it's something you don't really think about. I think what I care about, and this is something else I want to work on, where I want to scold other Marxists for being so bad about the animal question, is when you care about what Marx would say is species being, as in, every creature, including humans, wants to engage in certain behaviors. And this can be fairly flexible. And, obviously animals and humans change and all this, but generally humans have this Hegelian quality where they want to see themselves in the world. They want to have ideas and they want to externalize those ideas. And the problem with capitalism is that when we work and we have this externalization, it's not our own ideas, but it's capital, right? It's actually this economic system that just wants to create profitable, commodities. So we're doing things that we don't care about, and actually no one is actually in control of this process. So the human race is actually being subordinated to the ends of this non-human intangible thing that we call capital, right? Which is basically competitive pressures between capitalists, and also the threat of bankruptcy or unemployment amongst individuals. So that's why we act in these ways. And this idea that we want to return to this unalienated labor of actually doing what we want to do, or I think is important. That's where the way I've lived my life is, I've taken all these postdocs where I basically am working on projects that I want to work on, rather than maybe making more money doing something else that I don't enjoy, or teaching classes that I don't want to teach, or something like this. So I think that's one thing. The other thing would be, I think this intense attention to empathy in terms of actually caring about the species being of other creatures. So I think when Marxists talk about we want to liberate humans and all this, and create this good society where people can do what they want, but then they sound like reactionaries when they say, but we will dominate the world, and we will have so many slaughterhouses and factory farms because you can eat so much meat, and and reshape nature, and we'll move mountains, and we'll do geoengineering. And they then sound like conservatives, right? I don't think they realize the switch. So I think this consistency in terms of, wanting to have a society where people can do what they want, but also I'm not an anarchist, right? So I think the importance is placed on how do we create institutions where we can democratically decide between these trade-offs, as in, like, do I want to garden or do I want to write a book? And maybe I have to realize if I want to eat the next day, I have to do some gardening myself, or something like this, right? And make visible and conscious these economic choices, right? Instead of having them being decided by the market is important, and then also pursuing that goal of liberation for other creatures as well. So that's basically my worldview. And also, I would say one more thing in terms of this epistemology. Maybe we'll talk about this more later. Is that realizing that we cannot control nature, and therefore the world is too complex and too sublime, and we should make sure that it's functioning enough so we can have a good life, and we should not be hubristic and think that we know better than nature in some way.
Yeah, thank you. So there's themes there of liberation and freedom and individual autonomy, but there's also an empathy and a caring about the perspective of others, and wanting them to have what they want to some degree, I guess, which are common themes that can run through those things. And part of the reason I find these fundamental ethical grounding questions interesting is because quite often they are forgotten. So you'll talk to someone about, why they think neoliberalism might work, or you'll talk to someone about who has a Marxist perspective or a socialist democratic perspective or something else. And it's quite interesting to sometimes dig to say, well, okay, well, what is that system you're talking about? What is that approach ultimately trying to achieve for you? Is it about freedom and autonomy? Is it about happiness and well-being? Is it about flourishing? Is it about divine command theory or some other thing? What's the ultimate set of values that sits underneath those? And part of the reason I find that interesting is because from a complete amateur perspective, often even with people with very different worldviews, their underlying values seem to be quite consistent. So quite often you'll find someone who is quite in favor of a capitalistic or a neoliberal society talking about the freedom to produce and consume what you like and to work where you want. And the market mechanism gives you freedom to do that, which of course you can criticize because there's different versions of freedom and different constraints on that freedom. But ultimately, they might be looking towards a liberation and a flourishing, and they think their system is a better approach. In the same way, someone with a Marxist worldview would say, well, no, ultimately my aims are the same. It's about liberation, autonomy, and flourishing, but my system is better. But it can still sometimes make the discussion more productive if we've exposed those underlying values and we can explain in those terms why, what we're proposing is better or worse. But
No, I think you're right. I think it's useful to dig down and think what is the basic philosophical foundation of that worldview. And for the neoliberals, they assume that this market will produce the best possible outcome in the most rational way, but also the market is almost a semi-divine thing where it emerged spontaneously, but it's also very fragile. As in, like, neoliberals and Marxists talk about the market in very similar ways, but Marxists would say that this is bad, it's unconscious, powerful entity, while a neoliberal say it's a miracle, basically, and they actually draw
the invisible hand. Yeah.
But even more than that, so like if you look at Adam Smith, he will say there are market failures. Like there's ways the market doesn't do a very good job. And neoliberals would never say that. Neoliberals would say that the solution to a market failure is always more market. So they're much more extreme than 18th century liberals. But I suppose you're right that we want these similar things, but the question is, how do we actually get there? What are the institutions we need to?
I mean, and again, there are some that don't, right? There are some that have very different values. It is about their in-group, and it is about amassing power and influence, and it is about might makes right. These are real people too, who often manage to amass enormous power. But there are others who just have a genuine disagreement about the right way of economically or politically organizing to make things better. But so the other part of this question that would be good to come on to, which you've hinted at already, is the question of who matters. So if we're thinking about, well, being free is a good thing and having empathy for others, we should care about those others. But a critical question is, who are those others? So you talked about some vegetarians and your, moral scope expanding to include non-human animals. But again, it'd be interesting to know your sort of arc of your story about how you grew up thinking about other humans in terms of extending your compassion more broadly to other humans, but then critically breaking through that species boundary and getting serious about non-human animal ethics and recognizing that they are others that need to be considered in our thinking as well. What was that arc like for you?
One moment of, a real exercise in empathy was when I was a PhD student. I had a lot of friends who were women, and they were having a hard time, basically, for various reasons. And I wanted to think about this problem a bit more seriously. And for example, men cite themselves twice as often as women do. And that leads to real disparities, because if you look at like a citation database, and if one professor going in for tenure has more than the other, the man will get the job. But if he's citing himself, then that's a problem. And there's many other ways, due to sexism from students, or husbands who don't want to move for a woman's job and all this. But there's all these ways where a woman often start out at parity in terms of graduate school, but by a full professor, there's 3 to 1 men to women. And I do understand that, and I think for myself, I was upset, where I was just if I were a woman, and then I'd be really pissed off. This is also just very stupid. You go to the university and you think this is an intellectual place, and you find out it's just as sexist as anything else. really anti-intellectual, right? So I'm not the best person who succeeds or the smartest person, but the person who can get someone to do the dishes, so they or someone who takes parental leave and writes a book or something like that instead of looking after the kids. So that was important, but I think it's hard to. I mean, it's hard to talk about a process. I think that earlier crisis was a lot of things shifted very quickly in terms of caring about animals, and then when I was getting more involved in the environmental, and socialist movements, I was upset where people were really happy to talk about climate change, but they would never talk about say animal rights, or they wouldn't talk about the biodiversity crisis. And as I dug deeper and realized, to my shock in some ways, that to what degree factory farms and animal husbandry in general is a major driver for extinction and one of the greatest causes of climate change, and people just refuse to talk about it. I think I became really upset about that. And this feeling that we were just not having the right debates. We just kept on recurring. And that's why I want to write this book. Because I think if we're logical about things, if we think, how do we justify killing all these animals? When there's really no justification, then that's a huge problem. But also, if we actually want to do something about climate change, then we have to eat less meat. And that's the easiest thing to do that has the greatest amount of potential to rapidly cool the climate in terms of reducing methane emissions, but also stopping more pandemics from emerging and stopping the extinction crisis. But we just don't talk about it, and it just seems ridiculous.
It's bizarre, isn't it? It's even from a completely narrow anthropocentric point of view, it's still a no-brainer, obvious win-win, and yet. but I'm also interested in a way that's a nice link to one of the spectrums of choice when we're thinking about who gets to count morally, because you have got this default starting point where most humans might be anthropocentric, right? They're focused on humans mattering. And we know that there are plenty of problems within intrahuman ethics today where many groups around the world won't even get that far, right? It's about the in-group, or it's about privileging certain classes or groups or types of people that don't even get to sort of universal human moral consideration. But anthropocentrism, I guess, is the sort of humanity's default. The next level, which is, I guess, what I'm suggesting with sentientism, is sentiocentrism, where we expand that to every being that has the capacity to have experiences, to flourish, to suffer, to experience things at all. And therefore, almost by definition, to my mind, they should become a moral patient that we should express empathy and compassion for.
Well, I'll say one more thing about this expansion of empathy or interest, and I think it was as a historian, and again, this is related to my shift, from the right, because I remember taking this class in Cold War history, and the prof was basically teaching, well, the U.S., they were the good guys, Soviets were the bad guys, and thank God, the Americans won. And then as you started learning more about the history of the Cold War, it's well, who is supporting apartheid South Africa, or who's cooing every country in Latin America, or who killed Patrice Lumumba and all that. And it's all these people in the global South were deprived of having self-determination and a good life, and let alone my own country, where like Canada, we're the good guys and all that. Then you find out actually our mining companies are the most rapacious in the world, and let alone the genocide that happened against Indigenous people in Canada. We barely talk about it, right? So it's this. When you realize you're not, you realize you're the baddies, right? And that's an important moment as well, I would say.
I agree. And that shifting of perspective can be deeply unsettling, right? When you sort of open your eyes to those things. And I think, again, good epistemology and good history can be a path into that, because you cannot but recognize those things, right? And hopefully it leads people to a more expansive set of values where you recognize there are different perspectives, and people of all different perspectives all around the world with different backgrounds, ultimately all should matter. And I guess that's the naive hope behind ideas like human rights and universal human compassion, is that we unconditionally extend our compassion to all humans. And, sometimes, I don't know what you think about this, but it can, with some on the left, almost flip the other way around, where there can be a sense amongst some groups that I've realized that we're the baddies. We are the West, West are the baddies and are ultimately the only evil on the planet, that can lead some people to then withdraw solidarity and compassion from anyone who is oppressed by anyone who isn't the West, if that makes sense. So if you're a victim of Western oppression, we have solidarity. But if you're a victim of non-Western oppression, you're sort of conveniently ignored or pushed sideways. Whereas again, I'd like to take people back to that universal stance, which says, there are goodies, there are baddies, there are nuanced, difficult situations where there aren't necessarily goodies or baddies, but surely as the raw material for our ethics, every human being should matter and should warrant consideration and solidarity. And that seems to be sometimes a blind spot. And sometimes it's a deliberate blind spot on certain aspects of the right, because there's a more explicit, this is my group and the out group don't matter, as a deliberate choice. Whereas I'm almost more frustrated by some of the groups on the left who proclaim a universal solidarity, but actually it seems to be quite selective. But
yeah, I mean, there's lots of weird left positions that one's seen the last decade or so, especially where people are saying, actually, China's not oppressing the Uyghurs. And like,
yeah, what?
I think it's pretty bad, actually. And, you have to be a pro-regime change or supporting the CIA or something like this. But I think you can say, I wish China was socialist and democratic and respected the rights of self-determination of people within its borders. I mean, those things don't contradict each other. But
yeah, you don't just have to unconditionally pick a side and erase their crimes or
supporting Putin or Assad. You're like, I don't think they're on your side, So don't support these regimes. So yeah, it's strange.
Absolutely. So how about the next step, which is that one about non-human animals? Because again, I guess where I'm pushed towards is this sentiocentric stance that says, every being that can experience things warrants our compassion, because by definition, they seem to become a moral patient if they can be affected in some way. But you can go beyond that too. So the next level beyond sentiocentrism is biocentrism and ecocentrism. And these ways of thinking are quite common in the modern environmental movement, where people will say, look, it's not just sentient beings that matter, all living things matter, or beyond that, actually ecosystems themselves matter intrinsically. The earth has Gaia, rocks, rivers, trees, and the interconnectedness between these things as well. And I guess as an eco-socialist, how do you think about those more expansive concepts? Do you ultimately care about our shared environment because of its impact on the sentient beings, the quadrillions of sentient beings that live within it? Or do you think there's an independent intrinsic value to ecosystems that might, in some circumstances, warrant harming sentient beings or humans to protect the environment as a concept in its own right?
So, I mean, in the book we wrote, we really stress the importance of trade-offs. And I think it's important to say, like, yes, we care about the lives of every creature and all this, but supporting everyone's well-being will come at the cost for some. I was actually struck recently that there was a discussion among scientists where they could take a fossil and if they destroyed the fossil, then they would actually understand the origins of this species from 40 million years ago much better. But then they would have to destroy that fossil, right? Then it would be gone. And so there's a huge taboo against this destructive kind of knowledge production. And I was thinking that's so strange because obviously there's plenty of living creatures that scientists can destroy all the time and they don't feel that. So that only helps you as a lab animal if you die and covered in some marsh and you fossilize, and then several million years from now, then you'll be treated with this reverence. And my point there is that there's always, I think, a cost. So I'd say if we do give more rights to other creatures, definitely, maybe we would have fewer drugs produced, I think, obviously we can compensate to a large degree for animal testing or for, the livelihood of farmers and all this, but there will be some real costs. And I think we should reckon with that and not just wave them away. And similarly, this is a big divide, I think, between the animal rights movement and more environmentalist, conservationist groups, where predation is a question for some people, and be we should try to eliminate predation by genetically engineering tigers to, be vegetarian or something like this, or dropping lab meat on
Yeah,
the
feed them Beyond Burgers or yeah.
yeah. And I think this has to then go back to the question of epistemology, where like we do not know how these systems work well enough to manage interactions between billions or trillions of life forms. So, and having these ecosystems work is, something that's greater than the sum of its parts that we should care about. Or one could say, rewilding is controversial, and often species reintroductions don't work very well, right? And or the individuals that you're trying to save, let's say, and when they took the California condor out of the wild and then reared them in captivity and then returned them back into the wild, this comes at a cost. Like this is difficult and stressful for these individual animals, right? And it's like, when does the care for the species matter more than the care for the individual? And, I leaned towards that care about the ecosystem, but I think we shouldn't dismiss the care for the individual entirely. For example, if there's invasive species in some ecosystem, like this python in Florida, and then people say, well, I can kill that python and eat it, and I won't feel bad about it. I'm like, why don't we bring them back to where they're from or something, put them somewhere else, like in a sanctuary? I don't think this, like people often have like this bloodlust where they want to be told, what can I kill and not feel bad about? And I'm like, why do you want this so badly?
Yeah, the default response to any problems used to be kill them all. It's like a real strange driver. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, it's impossible to totally bridge these positions, but I think more has to be done to get closer at least, and
yeah.
Think about what trade-off can be lived with or what can be defended. But I think the harder pursuit of one versus another is probably also bad. That's my middle of the road answer.
Yeah, thank you. And I think there's something deeply important about holding on to that concept of the individual mattering because they matter to themselves. And maybe that links back to, sometimes that's one of the criticisms of neoliberalism is too much focus on the individual. And I can see where that can go wrong. But at the same time, it does seem like a really important safety mechanism to hold on to for me, at least a backstop where you consider the perspectives of all others in whatever you're doing. And that's partly because one reason I'm nervous about some of the aspects of biocentrism or ecocentrism, and maybe some aspects of collectivism too, can be that those concepts are often defined and shaped by powerful humans in ways that happen to suit us. So to my mind, if someone goes from a sort of anthropocentric stance to one where they jump to an ecocentrism, where they now have a rich concern for the ecosystem as a whole, but they've conveniently excluded vast quantities of very obviously sentient beings that are living in human labs and farms and fish farms from their moral consideration. And when you dig into their concern for the environment, it doesn't any longer seem to be a genuine concern for the environment as another. What it really is I want it to look pretty. I need a comfortable temperature. I want clean water, and I want a portfolio of ecosystem services. So in a way, and this is maybe a little cynical, but a lot of the modern environmental movement to me feels like it's presented as an expansive bio or ecocentrism. Like, look how generous we are with our moral scope. But you scratch the surface and really it's a thin veneer on yet more anthropocentrism. Whereas if we have that backstop of a genuine concern for the other, human others, non-human animal others that actually experience things in their own right. They suffer, they flourish, they have desires, they have interests. That's at least a safety mechanism at us, framing these concepts in self-serving ways that enable us to steamroller over or continue to exploit valid patients who are individuals who matter in their own right.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge problem with a lot of Marxists right now, where I think there's, again, Marxism is not a very big world and doesn't matter for, I'm sure, most of your listeners, but I think most eco-socialists, they just want a nicer way of dealing with the environment, but it's almost like they want to turn the world into the Netherlands, where, okay, it's green, it's like a farm, you have a couple of little parks, but it won't be this like rapacious, awful, like with slag heaps and all this. And that's good enough, right? They have no real interest in or maybe it's like, yeah, humane farming, or maybe even small scale farming where animals are still slaughtered and all this. And that's good enough because they don't really care about animals at some level, right? And I think that's generally true. And similarly, I think if it wasn't for the environmental crisis, a lot of these eco-socialists wouldn't care about animals at all, right? Or they wouldn't care about the environments at all. So it's like as soon as we put some carbon capture sequestration units and we switch over to renewables, then their interest in the environmental world just stops. And I think that's just a huge loss. I mean, huge mistake. I mean, I think they're missing the point. And similarly, when I was teaching a class once in the Netherlands, I was like, actually, if the world looked like the Netherlands, that would be a disaster, right? You would have like just no biodiversity, like so much nitrogen pollution, and it would just be horrible. And they struggled to deal with that. Or if you tell people, maybe we should reintroduce predators to where they used to be, like wolves to Britain or lions to Greece or something like this, and people are extremely antagonistic to that. And if even if some people are killed by these animals every year, it's still worth doing, and people are just very uncomfortable with that. I don't know. It's I think you're right. Most environmentalism, unfortunately, is very shallow. But the problem is that I think a lot of people who are going to this more dark ecology, like this more RNS egocentrist approach, they then become very anti-humanist, or people become really Malthusian and say we're better off without humans. And I don't think that's the solution either. Like I think humans can coexist with many other creatures, and we should care about those creatures, and we should figure out how we're going to divide at some level the earth between us and other creatures, so they have enough space for everyone. And those are the trade-offs that matter. But instead, we have these like stupid debates and these big swings into one direction or another.
Yeah, and part of that story is that blind spot about recognizing the salience of individuals, human and non-human. And again, it's a strange setup, because when you think politically, if you imagine those who are on the far right, for example, it's quite natural that they would exclude non-human animals from their moral scope, because they're quite comfortable excluding human animals from their moral scope to some degree. And it is a little bit more towards the might makes right. If we have the power and control, we can do what we like for our own in-group's interests, right? So that fits quite neatly with a worldview that excludes non-human animals from moral consideration. Whereas on the left, I guess I have higher expectations, because a simple story would say, look, we have concepts of compassion, solidarity, of understanding exploitation, of understanding oppression, and of recognizing the perspectives of the other, the alterity of the other, and the validity of those perspectives and the value in those perspectives, even if we don't completely understand them. So these are all aspects of thinking that run richly through the left. So again, it seems strange that those aren't naturally extended out beyond our own species. And when you take a historical lens too, when you look back at the links between animal agriculture and colonialism through, land hunger, and that was often one of the motivations for why these colonial powers needed more land, was feed crops and to ranch and to so on. So when you look through the historical links between the exploitative industries and some of the human-caused harms, again, there's some rich resonance there that you would think those on the left would be looking at that and go, look at what we've done. We need to turn it back. But it seems like I'm reading a wonderful book at the moment by Sil Ko called Aphro-ism. And one of the themes of their thinking is that the way the concept human has been framed historically is that it doesn't include all Homo sapiens. It includes a select, privileged, powerful group of Homo sapiens. And the concept of animality itself as a negative thing has been the driving force behind intrahuman discrimination of racism, sexism, and various other sorts. And it feels almost like what one part of the default project on the left is to try and fix that problem by making sure that we take all of those out-group Homo sapiens and bring them into the model human mode. And that partly involves telling them how they need to be and what they need to be and how they need to replicate the classic stereotype of the rich and powerful. So there's a problem there in the nature of that expansion. But it seems sometimes like the project of the left is, if we can make sure all Homo sapiens are included in the human, now we have some sort of universal sense of solidarity, then the job is done. That's as far as we need to go. But of course, that excludes countless quadrillions of non-human sentient beings that can suffer and have desires and interests just like we do. So I should stop rambling on, but what's your perspective on why this is such a searing blind spot in a movement that is supposed to be about, solidarity and ending oppression and
No, I think you're right. Where this is an old problem in philosophy. You think about Kant, it's like, you treat people as people, you treat things as things, and if you get the mixed up, that's a problem. And then I think about Cora Diamond's old essay, "Eating Animals, Eating People," and she was saying, Singer and others like miss the point when they talk about harms or pleasure and pain and all that, because no one's hurt when you eat your father when he dies, right? He's dead and then you cook him up. No one's getting hurt from that, but it's still, not something you do, right? So like who can you treat as a thing? Like who can you eat basically? And you can't. That's why people don't eat their pets, after they die, or they don't kill their pets like painlessly and then eat them, right? That's just seen as, that's just not the relationship you have, because that animal has some personhood, or obviously your family has personhood, so you don't do that. So I think you're right where the left is trying to police that boundary, as in like, what is that thing person now distinction? They think the solution is, okay, our species, everyone's part of this personhood, and therefore we have to make sure that border is very clear. We have to then exclude these animals. They cannot be persons. And that's where I think this is just a hunch for myself. And I was thinking about this after reading a friend's book on animal rights recently. That's like the problem of like Hitler's vegetarianism, right? Because it's just weird. It's just so strange that this happened. And obviously conservative.
Although I understand one of his favorite dishes was liver, so I'm not sure.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think there's some wobbliness to the story, but I don't know the details of it. But regardless, it's an interesting thought experiment because it's often
You could have
raised.
been a bad vegetarian. You could have been like a cheating vegetarian. That exists. I don't know. And plenty of other high-ranking Nazis were also vegetarian. And my hunch is that it was because it sounds just inconsistent. Like these brutal people who would kill millions. What's going on? But they care about animals. Like what's going on there? And I think this for them, that animal, that thing person boundary was just made differently. So it's just Jews and Roma and Slavs and communists. They are things, right? And therefore animals can be elevated in this like weird way of their worldview, but it's not inconsistent. So I think the point is to just, focus on this boundary problem and say, for the left, you should not think it's a threat to the personhood of humans if we extend personhood to other creatures or to ecosystems and all this. So but I think that having that debate is important. And I think it hasn't been done in a long time. And I'm really struggling with this now, where I want to write an essay on sausage socialism, like all these Marxists who like just hate veganism so much, right? And this has been the response to my book to a great degree.
I was going to ask what sort of response you've had on those ones. Yeah,
I've had some, I have some nice reviews, but some people are just very mad about veganism, and there's plenty of reasons, but it's just so strange because the emergence of socialism and the emergence of animal rights or animal liberation, these were actually twinned at birth. I mean, they were like the same story 200 years ago. And a lot of the leading campaigners, for one, belong to the other movement as well. And then there's this break in the mid-19th century. And I think to recall that history and also understand why did that break happen is important. Also hope to return to it, be like, yes, if you're a socialist, you should be a vegetarian. And if you care about animal rights, you should be a socialist, right?
Yeah, they should work both ways. Yeah. And your book hopefully is a contribution to that fiery debate. So, yeah. Well, that's fascinating. Thank you. Let's come on to this final question and the core of your book, which is how can we make a better world? And it's brilliant because some of my guests hesitate. They're not sure how to answer this, but you've actually written the book on what the answer is. So I don't know if you want to just sort of lay out the story for half-Earth socialism. What would it look like? How do we get there, and why is it a good answer? It's hard to do, I know, because
No,
I'm not.
I don't think it's that hard. I think it's I mean, it sounds a bit boastful to say that, but again, I study the neoliberals. They're just pumping out frameworks like crazy. They try things, they don't work. They try something else, and I just wish it was reversed, right? I wish socialists and environmentalists they were putting out frameworks and trying things out, and maybe some don't work and some do.
it it's almost a trope where people who have an anti-capitalist way of thinking or an anti-neoliberal way of thinking will say, well, what do you think that the answer is? And the response is often, I don't know, but it's not this. Or as you said before, we need to tear the system down and then see what emerges. It's like, well,
That's not
we
good
can
enough.
we
Yeah.
could do better than that, right? So sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, but it's like so one side, if socialists and animal rights people and all that, they're trying stuff out, and maybe it doesn't work, maybe it does. And the other side, these neoliberals, and all they do is write these very learned, very insightful critiques of real existing eco-socialism, but they don't propose any alternatives. That would be hilarious, I would love to live in that world, And so I think we don't realize how powerless we've made ourselves. That everyone says, "Oh, it's impossible to imagine the end of capitalism," and it's these neoliberals are preventing us from thinking and using our imagination. I don't think that's true. I think it actually comes from Marxism itself, where Marxism doesn't want people to imagine these alternatives. And this is Marx's own philosophical problems when he's relating his conception of socialism to the utopian socialist. But I think at some level to be brutal about it or to be frank about it would be like we should try something that works a bit better, right? And I think this refusal to think seriously about the future has not served the left or the environmental movement well. And we need to know what the other side is doing to realize that we've been co-opted in many ways where, the frameworks we do have actually are coming from neoliberals. So, a lot of people, they say either we'll have these small communes and, we'll have commons and all this. And that's from Eleanor Ostrom, and she was a neoliberal, right? Or the alternative is like we'll just dominate nature and we'll have geoengineering and go to other planets. And that's really from like Julian Simon, who's another neoliberal. So like either one side liberalism or another. But for the neoliberals, they can put all these ideas and they're consistent where they're just trying to prevent a state from intervening and shutting down market mechanisms, right? That's what they want to prevent. And I think we need to think, okay, if we're not going to use markets, this is going to be a really difficult thing. How do we plan the economy without markets? Obviously, there aren't that many successful examples of a planned economy or of socialist democracy. And we have to, and it's not useful to just say, oh, whatever happened to the Soviet Union, that wasn't socialism, that's to make state capitalism or something like this. I think that's not useful. I think it's useful to look and say, some smart people tried very hard to do something. Some people had ill intentions, like Stalin or I don't know what. There's plenty of people that did try to make it work, and it didn't work very, very well. But what can we learn from these planning debates? What worked and what didn't work? And we can look not just in the Eastern Bloc, but also in Chile and Cuba and many other places, and try to think through these problems, and also think through what can we actually take from nature to ensure a good life for everyone, but also prevent a mass extinction crisis, prevent a pandemic, and to prevent, climate change. And we have enough numbers to make some rough guesses. And that's what we tried to do in the book is, my co-author and I, we were just sick of reading books that tell you about the environmental crisis or capitalism and all this. And then the ending is just so vague and doesn't or wishy-washy, right? It doesn't really tell you about the costs that are entitled in ideas of a degrowth. Like what are we actually degrowing? What actually can we have? What is the good life? And in the book, we're trying to say it was called Half-Earth Socialism because we take this idea from E.O. Wilson, and it's like if half the world is wild, right? then it solves a lot of problems where, it's going to deal with extinction. It's going to allow a lot of carbon to be sequestered and so on. And then what are we going to do in this other half? Or what can we fit in this other half? So it's really a problem of land scarcity, having enough land for agriculture, renewable energy, carbon sequestration projects, and whatever the last one is, renewable energy, carbon sequestration, and rewilding. How do we have space for all these things? And we have to do the math, basically. So that's where veganism is amazing. Veganism is this silver bullet in a lot of ways, where it makes solving these problems as 1,000 times easier. So in the book, we don't really make this ethical case, although we can. But the argument for veganism emerges from this planning set of constraints. And so from the logic of this problem, it leads to veganism very quickly.
And that's one thing that I'm continuously frustrated by in the debate is there seem to be two aspects to this whole problem, particularly of our agricultural systems, that just are still radically neglected, but are absolutely fundamental. And one is just the sheer radical inefficiency of feed conversion ratios. It's just mind-blowing. And then how that drives land use. And both of those things together, even if you ignore the ethical question, seem to condemn the entire of animal agriculture as probably one of the craziest things humanity could ever want to do. The whole idea that depending on which type of farming you're doing, you probably are losing 90 to 95% of the calories and nutrients you put into that process in waste. And as you say, half of habitable land use is agriculture, and the vast majority of that is driven through feed crops and animal agriculture. It's mind-blowing. But those central core facts, feed conversion, land use, still don't seem to, they're bubbling up a little bit more in the discourse, but still nowhere near as much as you would think. It should be front and center. Yeah.
Yeah. People don't talk about it enough. You should be talking about it all the time, right? I think people don't really realize how bad the meat industry is. And people, when they talk about land use, they talk about suburbs and sprawl. And I'm not a big fan of suburbs and sprawl, but it's nothing compared to pasture, compared to CAFOs and feedlots and
human habitation, as I think is it less than 1% of habitable land?
Yeah, it's like 1 or 2 at most. Yeah, it's nothing. And so this is what we're trying to do in the book, is to find out these basic parameters, like what is the space we need for energy use, what do we need for vegan agriculture, what do we need for rewilding, and then my co-author Drew, he actually made a linear program, so to basically optimize this problem within a certain set of constraints, and he put it in like, okay, we have let's say 10 billion people in the next few decades. And they're all vegan, and then we have so much of the economy is electrified, right? And then are we using nuclear? Are we using renewables? And then it can tell you very quickly whether your plan is feasible or not. So this is like the gamble of the book is to say, if neoliberalism says that the market is unknowable, like you're just a stupid consumer and you just are trying to live your stupid life and you have no idea what's happening in the whole of the economy, and you can't see that, you can't control that. But the sum of these stupid interactions are the best possible thing to happen, the best of all possible worlds. That's the neoliberal view. Then socialism has to be the opposite, right? It has to be this democratic, conscious control of our economic relations amongst ourselves and also with nature, and by constraining them and seeing like there's limits to what we can take, and therefore we choose to restrain ourselves is important. So that's basically what we're trying to say. But you have to make these things visible. You do that through Neurath, a big influence for us. He ran exhibitions and developed graphic design that was just very simple. It's kind of pictographs, and try to show the economy to the working class of Vienna. And I think we need to do something similar. Like I've gone to museum exhibits on the Anthropocene, and it tells you things are bad, but it doesn't tell you what's causing this problem and what the alternatives look like. And I think you need to have these physical debates. And when people see that, then they're quite willing to give up meat, right? When you have citizens' assemblies, meat restrictions, maybe not far enough as we would like, but they're on the table in a way that whatever, government's climate plan, like never includes these things. Like people are not stupid, right? You don't need to have a PhD in these things to figure it out. So I
And
think,
there's an interesting parallel there because I think you're right there. I think individual people are more ready and willing to make these sort of changes because of that environmental story than maybe governments will allow them to express, and certainly more than the industry will allow them to express. And there's a parallel on the ethical stance as well. So there's some fascinating surveys that have been done around the world. If you just ask people, these are the basic practices of animal agriculture, or this is how factory farming works, do you think this is a good thing or not? People will say, large numbers of people, even majorities sometimes will say, this is wrong, this is unethical, we should stop doing it, in theory. So it feels to me like there is a sort of latent ethics and a latent environmental concern that could really drive some positive changes. But of course, we have social norms and entrenched interests and industries and lobbying and governments and so on that quite often just feel like they're trying to put a lid on that potential change. But
this is also, it's like, why should, I know it's wrong to eat meat, but like, why should I suffer? Why should I deprive myself when it does nothing, right?
almost nothing.
Well, I mean, yeah,
Yeah. Even little changes help you.
no. I obviously I'm vegan, but I mean, like, but there's a logic there. People be like, what am I doing? Like, why am I
It's the
inconveniencing?
system. Yeah.
But also it's like, and I think socialists then say, oh, this is consumerism, blah blah blah. It's so stupid. And then the point should be like, yeah, that's why this thing should be a social decision, right? We have to decide collectively and make it easier for us overall to not eat meat and to not eat animal products. And because like as an individual, you can't solve this problem. It has to be political. That's why the whole like fake, lab meat stuff was a dead end, right? There's always going to be political. And I think once you say, and I think a lot of people would be like, maybe I'm not keen to be vegetarian, but I know I should. And if it's easier and if everyone else is doing it and I see it has an impact,
Yeah.
do it. I think there's a lot of people like that, and
Yeah.
but we're missing that because it's we're not having these debates.
Agree. So even from the title of your book, obviously that story about land use and half the earth, and obviously the critical story of animal agriculture in that, and unwinding that is an essential part of it. And then socialism is another critical element to the story of how it should be organized too. And you hinted at this earlier on when people look back through history and say, well, when has socialism really worked? And there seem to be at least a couple of core challenges that come through when people are critiquing socialist modes of organization and politics. And one is the problem of information and decision making. So I guess the neoliberal stance and the sort of the market stance is, look, things are so complicated that you can't just come up with a central plan and drive forward and say, we'll make 1,000 size 5 boots and that's the answer, because the world is just too complicated for any sort of centralized state organization to ever properly understand or take intelligent decisions about. That's why you need the magic of the market with millions and trillions of little decisions that bubble together and theoretically good stuff happens. So what's your response in the book to that sort of information and decision making challenge of a more socially organized decision approach? Do you think can artificial intelligence give us a second chance where we might be able to actually work these things out better, or does it come through the democratic representation, or how do we handle that challenge?
I suppose it's what kind of knowledge production do we want? And I think it's like the market is very good at saying, okay, people in this part of the city, they really want to have purple toothbrushes, and over there not so much, and we'll move things around. And that's a hard kind of knowledge to capture, right? But the market is terrible at capturing other kinds of information. Obviously, the environmental crisis or the risk of pandemics or the suffering of animals. It can't include
the externalities.
Yeah, exactly. It can't externalize. I think this is important so like a neoclassical economist would say that to deal with these externalities, you just put a tax on them, and something like cigarette taxes or alcohol taxes, and that will balance it out and bring the economy back into equilibrium in some way. And a liberal would say that a planner or a bureaucrat doesn't have that knowledge to know how much the externality is worth. And therefore, you should create a market in that harm, which is what you get for cap and trade. And then a socialist would have to say you have to include that externality by internalizing it in the plan. Right? As in, let's say we make a plan and we're like, we need some iron to build so we get steel to build some wind turbines or whatever. Where are we going to put that mine? And I think we have to see that the whole set of relations where people near the mine, they'll have a probably greater chance of dying of cancer or something like this. And then what kind of compensation can we give? And to include those non-monetary details in the plan. Will the plan be less efficient for especially consumer goods? It definitely will be, right? So Drew and I were not really enthusiastic about, AI or algorithms and all this to like solve these problems. I think is like, what is the knowledge problems that we can live with. So probably a socialist economy will be more inefficient, and there will be shortages of certain things. And Kornai talks about this quite a bit. Like capitalism tends towards surplus and excess, and socialism to shortage. But it's like it's the knowledge production we care about is these environmental problems and non-monetary problems. So, and I think another thing would be in terms of motivational and informational problems would be to make work that is enjoyable enough, but that means more artisanal work, and that means less productive work. So we have to decide what work can be fun, and then people will want to do it, and therefore they'll give information to the planner, right? Versus work that will be less fun, and this is basically the realm of freedom and the realm of necessity in Marx. And so we also agree collectively we all want to have cheap shoes or whatever it is. So someone's going to have to we have to take turns going into the factory, working into doing unfun things because we care about this, and those kind of trade-offs have to be made. But it's not going to be perfect. I think like socialism doesn't need to be perfect. Socialism just needs to be better than what we have now. It needs to be able to arrest these environmental crises that we're facing because capitalism is unable to do them, right? But I think you're raising serious concerns, and I think this is where like delving into a century of planning theory is helpful to think through these problems because we're not the first people to confront them.
Yeah, thank you. And it's also refreshing that, again, as you're quite open about, we need to be clear that there will actually be trade-offs, right? We will probably lose some efficiency. We probably will lose some, maybe even some resilience somewhere. There may be shortages, but could it be better? That's the question. It's not, could it be perfect? Yeah.
Yeah, but it's also like, are we going to have fast fashion and, really cheap shoes and shirts and, no, because we don't want to have sweatshops and no one should work in these things. And, so like, there are definitely things would have to change drastically. Our homeowners who have a big suburban home, are they going to lose out? Probably, yeah, because, we don't want to have suburbs and we don't have private, we don't want housing to be commodified in basically a financial asset. I mean, like, there's big differences here and big problems here, but it should be surprising. It's not like to have an ecologically sustainable society, we just need to like tweak a couple of things and then we're there. Like we're very far away from where we need to be.
Yeah, which is why you need the analog of, the neoliberal think tanks and the thinking and the work, and that, you need that same volume of thinking to, explore that stuff, experiment and try things out and work things through. But
the thing is, like, we have thousands of academics and think tankers already. People are not connected and they're not coordinated, and they don't have any foundational philosophical assumptions that can guide like a bigger project. So we have this hodgepodge where like the neoliberals, they have 500 think tanks around the world employing like 20,000 people, and they're just pumping stuff out, Yeah.
Another criticism of socialist modes of organization is that while it's seen as a project that is trying to liberate, that it can end up in a more authoritarian place because there is the sense that, we need a more planned, more state mode of control because capitalism can't and neoliberalism can't deliver what we need. So we do need to impose control in a different way, but that can end up controlling too much, or that who gets to control that centralized power can end up in some difficult places as well, which can cut against the liberation. And there's also a sense that because there is more of an appreciation of the value of the collective, there is also a danger there that it's quite easy to end up crushing lots of individuals in the pursuit of some collective ultimate goal. So there are concerns about authoritarianism as a result of a socialist approach as well. What's your thought, again, in the book about how do you mitigate those risks or face off against those challenges? And again, many people would look at a capitalist system and say, well, look at the concentration of power and wealth and influence you already have, right? So
sure, yeah, we agree.
So how do you respond to those sorts of risks?
No, again, I think we have to say socialism has had a lot of failures, right? And I think socialism will be difficult to implement. And the way I see it is, capitalism will definitely fail, and it's definitely getting worse. And it definitely will destroy the planet, and it will destroy culture. It will destroy, human interaction and relationships, and we'll just all be on phones or have chips in our brains, and playing video games as the world dies. So I mean, that's there'd be like one trillionaire, and everyone else will be working these gig jobs. So I mean, that's where we're going, right? And that train's not going to get off that track. And the socialism offers the possibility of freedom, offers the possibility of ecological stability and all that. But it means that we have to choose how we're governing ourselves, and we may not do a good job with that. And I think we have to be honest about these risks. And there's no automatic utopia. It's not like, okay, after the revolution, put it in the algorithm, then we're done. I mean, it's going to be really hard to rule ourselves. And but that's the only thing that can allow the good life and can allow other creatures to survive and so forth. So that's the way I see the problem. But I think this is where I'm really drawn to the work of C.L.R. James, who's a Trotskyist from Trinidad. And he wrote this essay just before, when was it? Just after the invasion of Hungary by the Soviets in 1956. And it was called Every Cook Can Govern. And there he's like, socialism has this problem where you have this party elite, which can become tyrannical, or it has this bureaucratic elite, which can become self-serving and also undemocratic. And how do we overcome these problems? It basically, in a capitalist economy, you have coercion, and the coercion is caused through the market, as in you lose your job, you can't feed yourself, or whatever it is. Your firm goes bankrupt, so it forces you to act in certain ways. And a social system, where is that coercion, right? And it's to what degree can we motivate people and not rely on coercion? And to what degree have other regimes substituted market mechanisms for, basically a gun? I mean, that's Stalinism grew, was successful in growing the economy, but it was a reason why it was so violent, right? Because it had to replace that market coercion with very intense coercion. So this is where socialism probably will not be as economically dynamic, because we don't want to have that coercive power. We want people to be motivated. And therefore, we also need to make sure it's democratic and not have this bureaucratic problem by having direct democracy. So C.L.R. James, he looked to ancient Athens and said people there just governed themselves, and they were in government as well. And everyone took turns running the state, and they would serve once or twice in their life, but everyone would go through it. I mean, obviously it was free men, but in principle it could be expanded to include everyone in a socialist society. And people, it's very interesting to look at ancient Athens. It was a very poor society, but people were very literate, and partially because people knew they eventually would be in government, so they cared more about education. Right, so because they wanted to participate. And the word for idiot is a Greek word. It comes from people who did not want to participate in public life. So and there's plenty of other socialists who are also interested in this Greek example. And I think this is where we have to think about, we have to rely on lottery, as in picking people randomly, and but also fairly. So the Greeks had this, basically a very kind of rudimentary computer where it would choose people randomly by district. So we have a fair distribution from each district, right? And when we have citizens assemblies now, they use a similar approach to make sure we have enough women, we have enough working class people, and all that. So we can do these things, and citizen assemblies are quite powerful, but we should have them instead of parliaments, right? As in these institutions should be the socialist governing institutions, all the way up to a global parliament. And that's the way I see. But that's these are difficult institutions to imagine, right? How they work and all that. But I think James is pointing us to a fruitful dimension because I don't think socialism is just going to look like bourgeois democracy, but slightly more left. I think it's going to require totally different institutions to work.
Yeah, thank you. One question was about the nature of the solutions you have in mind, because another thing that seems to flow through quite a lot of the environmental movement and some aspects of eco-socialism is maybe a sort of romantic view of nature, whatever that is, and a sort of rejection of human technological solutions that can lead people to be very skeptical about certain types of answers. And when we're looking at these big problems, my sense is that our solutions should be ethically constrained, and they should be constrained in terms of a ecosystem or environmental concern, but let's not put other constraints on ourselves unnecessarily because of some sort of romantic view of nature or a technophobia. So I won't take you through a load of examples, but the sorts of things that come up are ideas about nuclear power or GMO technologies, clean meat and cultivated meats and so on. What's your sort of sense about the role of technology and human innovation in fixing these things? Are there ways of avoiding a sort of wanting to go back to a primitivist, romantic view of how the world was? Can we make positive progress with these technologies as part of your solution for Half-Earth Socialism?
I think our approach is in between, where we're not anti-technology, where we have to go back to the land and scythe wheat ourselves, but I think it's not fetishizing technology. And I think the way we see it is when you make a plan, you should assume existing technologies, because the problem of developing and then scaling up technologies will probably take 20, 30 years in a lot of cases, or may never happen for something like fusion. There have been some small improvements, but we're very far away. And even if we do have fusion, it still would have a lot of problems as well. There's some nice articles criticizing fusion in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And so similar with these carbon capture and sequestration projects, like they, to even draw down like 10% of emissions, like 3 gigatons or something like that, we require just like a huge infrastructure, like equal to in scope to the present fossil fuel infrastructure. And we're just not going to build that fast enough. I mean, it's the nuclear problem is like, okay, first of all, nuclear is like the only thing that really gets a majority support in a lot of places, right? People don't like nuclear, and there have been referendums in lots of countries, and it's the one thing that really gets people out onto the street. So it seems
so there's a practical political angle to that. Yeah,
I think like you don't want to demobilize people, right? And the thing is, even if, okay, so you like nuclear and you ignore the terrible costs in terms of like mining or to deal with the toxic waste, which are very, very serious problems. I'm Canadian. A lot of uranium mining happens in northern Saskatchewan, and it's incredible health problems amongst Indigenous people around there because of the mining. It's very, very tragic, and let alone other places. But if you scale up nuclear reactors to the degree necessary, like James Hansen's, like we have to build 135 a year for the next 30 years. And even that would just replace electricity, right? It wouldn't replace all energy production. You would run out of accessible uranium very quickly, right? And then to go after the more difficult deposits, your carbon intensity would just shoot up. And so I don't think it's going to work. So the simple solutions we say are, renewables work well enough. They take up space, but they work. And rewilding works very well as well. So, and we have public transport. We don't need autonomous cars, whatever. Just get people on trams. And I'm not going to wait around for lab meat to work. We can eat lentils, or, like if the problem is serious enough as it is, then we shouldn't have to wait for these fussy eaters. I mean, like they should just get on board. Either it's serious or it's not. So this is where we're in between, but I think hopefully it makes a bit of sense.
It does, yeah. So you're open to new technologies, but you've got to be realistic about what they can actually do, and don't let them become a distraction from an even more obvious, even more immediate answer we have right now that we should just jump to. So.
I mean, we have to be doing all this stuff now. Like we have to be decreasing carbon emissions or whatever it is. Like we're way past overshoots. It's like 10% a year, and and we need to be rewilding go from like 10% to 50% like as quickly as possible. I mean, like we just don't have time to wait for these technologies. Like in the future, if they become available, sure, like let's reconsider these plans. These plans are not set in stone, but let's use existing technologies.
Yeah. On the rewilding point, there is a developing field of philosophy that's thinking about the problem of wild animal suffering. And there's a scientific study of welfare biology and trying to understand what it's really like to be an animal living free ranging in the wild. Is there space in the concept of this half Earth that we will rewild to think about the types of ecosystems there to make them less suffering dense? Could you imagine a type of rewilding which is more about large herbivores, short trophic chains, so on and so forth? Or is that just going too far with a sentiocentric concern for the experiences of wild animals? And your idea of rewilding literally is hands off, let it go, regardless of what it's like for those beings.
I think it's condescending for us to decide what's the best life for these animals. I think I have many problems with utilitarianism, but I think suffering is not the most important problem. I would say oppression is. And I think if someone said, oh, we can just put people on VR and give them morphine and no one will suffer again, I'll be like, well, I think I may have suffered in my life, but I'm happy that I'm free, more or less, right? And I think we should also not ignore what animal experience is like. I'm sure being a wild animal is very difficult and very painful and very terrifying, but I'm sure there's plenty of beauty that they get to experience as well. And I don't think we should intervene just out of respect for their own species being or autonomy or however you want to put it.
Thank you. And one of my recent guests, well, it was a while back, Heather Brownie, is, some of her work is making that point, is that, yes, there are terrible problems of suffering in the wild, but let's not underestimate the positives too. And it is a difficult trade-off, because the flip side is that even within the human species, I can imagine a world where there's no more oppression, but there's still terrible suffering. And to me, that's still a problem, because I have compassion for those suffering beings, even if they're not being oppressed. I think anyone could join forces and say, look, the oppression is bad. But even without the oppression, I'm not sure the job is quite done there. But again, we could probably spend another hour digging into that. So I need to let you go. But it's been fascinating to walk through that. You've laid out a vision, a compelling, really challenging vision, but a practical one about how we could move forward. How do you think of your prospects of moving towards that sort of idea politically, democratically, in terms of human values as well? Because in a way, that's part of my project. It's almost sort of neutral to the political and economic system. It's just saying, look, if we can upgrade our epistemology to be naturalistically grounded, and we can genuinely care about all beings that have the capacity to have experiences, to want their own freedom, to value their own existence, then whatever system we apply hopefully would work in a more positive direction. But how do you think, in terms of values and democracy, we might be able to move towards the sort of solution you've laid out in the book?
Well, I would say, from a Marxist point of view, the problem with capitalism is that it's basically trying to create a second nature, right? It's trying to change these natural flows and redirect them towards commodity production. And from the capitalist point of view, it doesn't matter if that's coal or solar power or animal, flesh or, human labor, right? They're all redirected. And therefore, as Marxists, we should be horrified of that, but also find sympathy for our fellow suffering beings and try to free them. And this is where I would say, even if all these capitalists agree, like, we care about animals and all this, these capitalist pressures are just so intense that I don't think they can be avoided. That's one thing. But the other thing would be, as in, like, what's going to happen next? And it's like so neoliberalism is having a hard time. They're still doing fairly well, but it's getting harder for them to really convince people that the market is working for them. And they have to make alliances ever more frequently with fascists. And fascism is on the rise. And I think it's strange when people don't want to call it what it is. They would say, like, right populist or whatever. I'm like, they're fascists. Okay, so it's a threat in a lot of places. And either the left and environmentalists are going to come, and animal liberationists are going to come up with a compelling alternative, or we're going to have this kind of neoliberal fascist hybrid. So I'm not, I think you can't write a political book and think this is the one that's going to change everything. I think that's delusional, but I think eventually we will have to come up with something that is different from what we have now, or it's going to get really bad, right? So there's only two possibilities there. And basically my hope was to contribute to this discussion in my own modest way, to get people to start thinking about things. And I'm very happy to try to stir up trouble and to organize people, but we need many of these kind of books and these kind of ideas. And we need to have these debates about what comes afterwards, because things are getting bad really quickly these days. And we can't just be satisfied with critique, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's so important that you've actually laid out a vision for, a different path. So yeah, thank you for that. I was going to say, what's the best way of people buying the book, coming and playing with the computer game version, following you more generally and your work?
Yeah. I mean, I just want to say that it's been quite funny to write this book because, it's been talked about in the lefty press enough, but again, the veganism is the problem. And we've had trouble talking to the more animal rights community, but when we have, they've been more receptive to socialism, right? Much more. Even people who haven't read Marx, they're like, yeah, maybe capitalism isn't working. So I was happy to go on this show because we really want to talk to vegans more, and we want to talk about people who care about animals more. And we wrote this book. We were thinking we're going to talk to socialists, we're going to talk to animal liberationists, and the other goal was to talk to scientists and more mainstream environmentalists. And it's been tough to reach these groups. People are either put off by the socialism or they're put off by the veganism. But the goal is
you really picked your subjects, yeah.
Yeah, this is like the narrowest political tendency you can imagine, this vegan communism, But I think every group has to learn from another and then see that they are facing a common enemy and unify. And it's just so painful trying to get that message out there. So it's a pleasure to be on the show. In terms of where people can get the book and all that, they can go to Verso and get the book there. They have sales all the time, so check it out. And hopefully you put a link. We play the game on Steam. If you're a gamer, you know what Steam is. And if you're not, then you can go to our website, which is play.half.earth.
Yeah, cool. I will include links in the show notes. Do you do much social media beyond that at all, or?
No, Twitter was a kind of a waste of time, and I just want to write and read, so I'm not really. But we are going on tour a little bit, and Drew and I, because the paperback's coming out, and we want to push the book. So we'll be in the UK and France and the Netherlands, and we're actually thinking of making a Discord, as in like some kind of online group, because there have been plenty of people who have written to us and been interested in like what comes next, or what do we do next. And so we want to kind of get people together, get people talking to each other, maybe they come up with their own projects and all that.
Yeah, magic.
And so just email me. I'm very approachable.
Old school. Yeah, thank you. Well, I can only offer you a tiny but lovely and thoughtful audience, but I'm sure they'll find your ideas fascinating. So thank you. It's been such a pleasure to have you as a guest on Sentientism. I'll let you go for your run.
It's a very, really nice chat, and I really appreciate the invitation, and thanks so much.
Thanks, Troy. Take care. Speak to you soon. Stay in touch.